please subscribe to our newsletter with the same title. First, we are going to start with the headlines from the previous month. This month, the MFRR in Focus opens with the news of conflict coverage due to the war going on in Ukraine. In recent weeks, many journalists had to flee from Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, seeking refuge in other countries. While these countries are not currently under MFRR mandate, the members of the consortium have mobilized their capacity to offer emergency support for journalists and media workers in urgent need. One such offer is organized by Free Press Unlimited under the title of Media Lifeline Ukraine, offering protection for journalists and making sure reliable information remains available in the country. Also, the Emergency Assistance Fund, Reporters Respond, is available for journalists in these countries, as well as the IFJ's Safety Fund. In addition, we would like to announce that, in coordination with the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom and the European Federation of Journalists, the government of the Republic of Kosovo will be allocating 150,000 euros from the state resource to shelter 20 journalists from Ukraine. Finally, we would like to remind our viewers that the MFRR Summit 2022 Boosting Press Freedom is coming up. Between 22nd and the 24th of March, you can find more information on the summit on our website under mfrr.eu/mfrr-summit and bookmark panels and register for the workshops. You may also find more information on these developments from the past month in our newsletter, and check our website mfrr.eu to read the joint statements on press and media freedom violations, developments regarding media freedom. This month, our focus is going to be women in journalism, and today's episode we will start with a short interview with Article 19's human rights lawyer Paulina Gutiérrez. She leads the law and policy work on freedom of expression and non-discrimination and the safety of journalists. Paulina, welcome.
Hello, Gurkan. Thank you very much for having us here today. We're very happy.
So glad to have you. I would like to quickly start with a question. Why is online abuse against women journalists a free expression issue?
Well, it's important to start saying that the different patterns of abuse and manifestations that we see online, discriminatory attacks, the different threats they receive online, they are just like a continuum of the different entrenched discriminatory practices that happen offline. So when we talk about freedom of expression and online abuse and harassment against women journalists, we need to see it as a freedom of expression issue for various reasons. So the first one is because freedom of expression is a key means and a tool to tackle and ending discrimination against women. When women journalists exercise their right to freedom of expression, let's say either to report on sexual harassment or to decide to cover on issues that were traditionally assigned to men, like, for example, corruption or politics, or when they decide also just to raise their voice and to start covering issues that would otherwise be unreported, these attacks reduce their ability and they're willing to continue reporting. So this represents a restriction to the right to freedom of expression, and that's why it should be a freedom of expression concern. And what this impacts in their right is not only their ability to continue reporting, but it inevitably limits their activities to challenge discrimination. And that's why for us in Article 19, we keep trying to push for this approach in which we define how the right to freedom of expression, the right to non-discrimination and equality of women, instead of being against each other, they are reinforcing. And they are reinforcing rights and they complement each other. So that's why when we talk about women journalists and they start going out of line and they decide to silence themselves, it is not only them that their right is being restricted, but it's also society losing their voices and their contribution in open debate.
Thank you, Paulina. And also last month, we have hosted a journalist who was subjected to online harassment. And currently, as the MFRR, we are working on development of a new support mechanism to offer peer-to-peer support for subjects of online abuse. And my second question is, what is the scope of state obligations to address online harassment and abuse of women journalists and to conduct effective investigations into online harassment and abuse?
Yes. So when we talk about the state obligations, and when we talk under this framework and approach of women's rights to freedom of expression and women's rights to non-discrimination and equality. So when we talk about these, states have their general obligations to ensure that women can enjoy the right to freedom of expression. And this should be done through different means, different measures. So one is, of course, they need to have like a strong legal framework protecting the right to freedom of expression. And of course, when it comes to protect the journalistic expression of women, then there is like these two frameworks that need to come to interact and to rely upon by states. And we talk about, for example, when we talk about preventive measures, they have the obligation to prevent attacks against women journalists. And this applies both offline and online. So it's not that they need to be different. And this involves, of course, like having enabling environment. An enabling environment also comprises having strong legal framework. But for example, if in some countries where already exists protection mechanisms, let's say, or working groups on the safety of journalists. So when this applies to journalists in general, but when it comes to women journalists, the states have this obligation to ensure that there is like this gender perspective, that these mechanisms are accessible for all women, that these mechanisms have these special approaches on gender and non-discrimination. Because women, when we bring these two frameworks, we realize that women have additional obstacles to exercise their rights, and this concerns the right to freedom of expression. And when we talk about investigations, this issue has become a very relevant one in the context of online attacks, because we have seen that many journalists decide not to report because law enforcement authorities will just decide that this is not sufficiently serious to initiate an investigation. But this have like different layers of problems. One could be like maybe they need to review, that the government needs to start reviewing the different laws. But secondly, we also need the law enforcement to be trained and to understand how these different manifestations are impacting not only in the integrity of women, their safety, but also their right to freedom of expression.
And in recent months, during our meetings with different stakeholders, we have also come to realization that many journalists also consider reporting these incidents as not being relevant. However, let us remind once again that there is no small report, that all these cases must be reported. But also platforms have responsibility when it comes to online harassment and online targeting. What has been the response of digital platforms so far, and how should it be strengthened?
Well, companies have, in the recent, let's say 3-4 years, companies have tried to listen to the concerns of different groups that are being harassed and abused online. They have developed different conversations with them. They have developed different tools, for example, in Twitter, where you can start like deciding if you want people to interact with your tweet or not. In Facebook, that you have like they're developing different tools for users in this case to have the option to decide if they want to delete comments, if they want to silence them, if they want to see certain accounts, or just to avoid looking at certain words, and I think I start with this because I think they are doing things, but this is just not addressing the underlying issue, right? Like they try to develop different measures, they change even some of their policies, community standards, the different norms that regulate their interactions in their platforms. But the truth is that, they don't have like a specific approach on gender or women, like they are starting to develop some policies around special groups or protected characteristics. But when women are facing these situations, they are facing different threats, and even when they are coordinated, or if they are like their information that is put online is putting them at serious risks and real risk. So the problem that we have with platforms is that they are not responding adequately. So these measures are not addressing sufficiently the problem. And what we also have seen is that in many countries, as they lack of a contextual assessment, or they don't have like the sufficient resources invested on translating and understanding the context of some threats and some attacks, this definitely undermines their responses and undermine the way that women can report, or even the trust that they can have in accessing to these reports. So we have, I mean, there are a lot of women journalist groups, media groups, human rights groups, freedom of expression groups, trying to talk with companies and tell them that their approach needs to change, because they have this responsibility to ensure that their services are not used to restrict and to put women journalists at risk.
And thank you so much, Paulina. And let us remind our viewers once again that next week during the MFRR Summit, we will again be touching upon online harassment, and it is going to be on our first day of the MFRR Summit. Thank you so much for joining us today, Paulina. And next in our program, we will continue with Antje Schlaf from the ECPMF to present the statistics from Mapping Media Freedom with a focus on attacks against women journalists.
Thank you, Gürkan. Today, I want to give you some insights on attacks against women journalists documented on Mapping Media Freedom. In total, we documented more than 1,500 attacks against women journalists, and in the year 2021, we recorded 146 attacks against women journalists in countries monitored by the MFRR project. Let's have a look at the main type of attacks against women journalists. Nearly 1 out of 5 incidents includes physical attacks. More than half of them includes verbal attacks such as intimidation, threatening, insult, abuse. Nearly 1 out of 10 incidents includes attacks against property such as equipment or personal belongings, and nearly a quarter of them includes legal attacks, and 6% is censorship. Let's have a look at a comparison to attacks targeted against men journalists, and we see huge differences here. Women journalists face lower proportions of physical attacks, but much higher proportions of verbal attacks. Let's have a look at the sources of the attacks. The main perpetrators against women journalists are private individuals with nearly 40%, followed by police with nearly 1 out of 5 incidents being involved. And we have also 16% being performed by unknown sources of incident. This is mainly attacks happening online or digital, of online harassment, where we couldn't clearly identify if it was a private individual behind the attack or an organization. So where the people don't reveal their identity. Let's have a look again at the comparison to attacks against men journalists. We again see differences here. Women journalists face less attacks performed by private individuals and less by police, but much higher rates performed by unknown sources of incidents. Let's have a look at where the attacks happened. Online and digital attacks are on place 1 with nearly a quarter, closely followed by attacks during a demonstration and protests and attacks on public places or streets, but there are also others. If we again compare this to attacks against men journalists, we see again huge differences. For men journalists, the most frequent place of attacks are demonstrations and protests. And for women, they have much higher rates of being online or digitally attacked, and also higher rates for attacks on public places or streets. So, to summarize, what are the main issues for women journalists? We see higher proportions of verbal attacks with a factor of 1.5, higher proportions of attacks performed by unknown sources, and higher proportions of online and digital attacks, so online harassment. However, these are the outstanding aspects when we compare attacks against women journalists to attacks against men journalists. But we also need to note that there are other attacks or other aspects women might face less proportionally, but still on a high rate. So if nearly 1 out of 5 incidents includes physical attacks, or nearly a quarter legal attacks, or nearly 1 out of 5 incidents is performed by police, these are main issues for women journalists still, even if they're a bit lower than for men journalists. So, and again, as well as for protests, these are frequent places where also women journalists get attacked, or public places and streets. So if we want to improve the situation for women journalists, we have to tackle the aspects of verbal attacks and online harassment, of course, but we also have to have an eye on general aspects like physical attacks or attacks by private individuals, police, or protests. That's the overview on attacks against women journalists. Back to Gürkan.
Thank you so much, Antje, for presenting us with the statistics from the past month and also the women journalists. And this month, OBCT's Francesca Rita interviewed Alice Baroni for the MFRR in Focus concerning the condition of women journalists in Europe.
Thank you, Gürkan. During this episode, we are seeing that women journalists are one of the most vulnerable categories of media workers. Gender inequalities are still widely present in many European countries, in the form, for example, of pay gaps or career advancement. Attacks against women journalists take very often the form of online harassment, while the perpetrators of the attacks are too often unknown. We have the pleasure to host Alice Baroni, a Start UNIPD Research Fellow at the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies at the University of Padua. Welcome, Alice. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gürkan and Francesca, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
One of her most recent contributions is that for the Media for Democracy Monitor, which delivers an overview of the news media's performance regarding freedom, equality, and control across 18 countries. In light of your collaboration with the 2021 Media for Democracy Monitor, how would you assess the condition of women journalists in different European countries? What are the most common types of attacks and threats against them?
Yes, sure. In general terms, the MDM results indicate that leading news media organizations is performing poorly concerning gender equality. It means that women journalists endure gender inequalities in media structures as well as in media content in the European countries that participate in the study, with the exception of Sweden, where women are a majority in top positions in newsrooms, or in countries such as Finland, where gender equality is protected by law and women have equal opportunities to proceed and develop their careers as journalists. Journalists located in other participating countries such as Austria, Belgium, and Italy, just to cite a few, are faced with differences in conditions, salaries, and unequal opportunities for career advancement in the media sector. When it comes to media content, the situation is even worse. The underrepresentation of women in media content is recognized as the most pronounced weakness and deficit among all indicators of the 2021 edition of the MDM. Regarding the attacks and threats on journalists, the rise in violent intimidation and harassment of women and ethnic minority journalists online, perpetrated increasingly by the political right, is seen by the interviewees as the most greatest threats to journalism and democracy today. Despite the cultural differences in situations, harassment and intimidation of women journalists is an increasing problem in most MDM countries. The few exceptions lie in countries such as Austria, Portugal, and Iceland, where harassment of journalists is rare or none, but journalists can rely on legal support and protection from their employers in case it occurs. On the other hand, Italy features as the country in Europe where journalist safety is most threatened by online harassment, personal assaults, and intimidation, often connected to reporting on organized crime and mafia issues, fascist groups, and more recently, anti-vaccine protesters.
The understanding of the entanglement of online harassment and offline abuse is an emerging area of research. You recently conducted a research focused on Italy and Brazil called Advocate, addressing visual imagery in online harassment and offline abuse against women journalists. Can you tell us a bit more about the Italian case and the intertwining between online abuse, offline aggressive behavior, and the place of the visual imagery?
Yes. I have a small data set of 42 Italian women journalists who responded to the survey that mapped different types of abuses, online and offline attacks, and the entanglement between the two, image-based abuse and digital attacks. The survey findings suggest that gender hate speech and cyberstalking have become a mainstay in women journalists' working routines in Italy. The online attacks are very sexist and related to journalists' physical features, not to the news content, which can also be seen as a pattern in international trends in online violence against women journalists. In comparison to the Brazilian situation, the attacks in Italy are less orchestrated, which means Italian women journalists recognize hostile individuals as the main perpetrators of attacks instead of organized hate campaigns, political interest groups, for example. In the entanglement between online and offline harassment and attacks is low. When it comes to image-based abuse, the use of images, memes, or videos to intimidate, harass, embarrass, and ultimately silence women journalists, Italian journalists recognize this type of abuse as a greater source of psychological distress compared to gender-based hate speech. Regarding digital attacks, there is a lack of awareness regarding whether they had emails intercepted or data stolen, included in the cloud, which is worrying because this lack of awareness endangers not only journalists, but also their information sources.
You were mentioning the psychological distress. In your opinion, what is the effect of such intertwining of abuses on women journalists?
It has implications for journalists' mental health, risk increasing self-censorship, news gathering and reporting, and influence their future career prospects. The intimidation, harassment, and physical attacks directed at women journalists violate freedom of expression and media freedom and affects the right of society to access a plurality of information or threatens democracy. The intertwining of abuses on women journalists, particularly in Italy, should be considered in association with the precarious labor conditions of the journalism profession in the country. That constitutes a major threat to the safety of women journalists because the majority is freelance and hence unwilling to report the threats and attacks they face on a daily basis.
Thank you, Alice, for taking part in this episode and for outlining the challenges of women journalists.
Thank you, Francesca and Alice. And next in MFRR in Focus, the panel discussion is focusing on freedom of expression and women in journalism. Roberta Tavari from Article 19 is moderating the discussion this month, and we will hear views from two prominent women journalists.
Thank you, Gurkan, and welcome to today's panel discussion on freedom of expression and women in journalism, where we will explore some of the key aspects that pertain to the journalistic profession from a gender point of view, and how these may impact on freedom of expression. As a way of a brief introduction, it has been often documented how women journalists face some unique risks related to their gender in their profession. These may range between workplace harassment to online threats, verbal or physical attacks. Women journalists are particularly vulnerable to these obstacles, being often targeted for their independent reporting and also because of their gender. Nowadays, also the online space has become an extremely toxic environment for women journalists. At Article 19, for example, we documented that women journalists are often targeted online for the purposes of threatening, intimidating, and silencing their voices and the stories they raise. According to the alerts submitted to the Media Freedom Rapid Response platform, it is also evident how women journalists are more prone to be harassed online than men. These threats do not just pose a risk to women's safety, but to the right to freedom of expression and to the societal right to receive a whole variety of information from diverse sources. An appropriate response to these issues should not overlook the need to strengthen the right to freedom of expression and call states to respect their obligations under international human rights law to protect women journalists. Recently, Article 19 published the first of a series of advocacy sheets to support women journalists in their advocacy, which is actually available on our website. Turning to our guests today, I'm pleased to be joined by two women journalists with whom we will discuss some of these aspects and hear more from their first-hand experiences in journalism. Firstly, we have with us Dia Morina. She is a research coordinator at the Coalition for Women in Journalism, an organization that advocates for safety and for an enabling environment for women journalists, documents threats against them, and fosters networking. Dia is a journalist herself, and before joining the coalition, she covered issues such as politics and war crimes in Kosovo. Welcome, Dia. And we also have Arzu Geybulla. Arzu is a prominent Azerbaijani journalist now based in Turkey, whose work was published on internationally recognized outlets such as Foreign Policy and Al Jazeera. In her coverage, Arzu focuses on digital authoritarianism and its implications on human rights and press freedom, both in Azerbaijan but also beyond. Welcome, Arzu. So to start our discussion today, I'd like to ask a couple of questions to both of you, Dia and Arzu. Firstly, as women journalists, did you experience your profession differently than your male colleagues? And if so, what were the unique aspects or situations that you faced as part of your profession?
I'm happy to start if Dia doesn't mind. You know, I've actually thought about this question for a bit, and I think I haven't really noticed much difference as a woman journalist writing stories. If anything, in some cases, perhaps I had a bit of an advantage to my male colleagues, especially if, you know, I was doing a story in domestic violence or persecution of women in specific cases where there was, you know, a gender-specific story to tell. I think there was like a level of comfort that was developed between the person whose story I was telling and myself. So yeah, I think I really haven't had experienced that much difference when it comes to reporting per se. The biggest difference that I've seen has been in the response and the comments and the type of feedback that you get on social media platforms.
Thank you, Arzu. And Dia, would you have anything to share with us?
Yeah, I think different from Arzu, personally, I did feel there's differences, especially during my maternity leave. I was working in one of the most prominent media in the region, and during the maternity leave, I received an email that my contract has been changed. And for me, that came as a surprise because one of the main focus in our media was promoting women's rights, and I never expected something like that to happen. Experiencing a postpartum depression and receiving an email like that was really one of the hardest moments I had as a journalist. But I was lucky that after 1 hour, I received another email that some very big international media was checking if I was available to join them after the maternity leave. So it gave me like a boost, but yes, this is what I experienced. And I saw that in Kosovo and in regional media. I saw that women journalists were in this specific moments of their life, they were kind of afraid to get pregnant because of possibility to lose their jobs. And until that moment, I didn't really pay attention to the environment in this regard, but then it started to become like my main issue to deal with. to talk with women journalists and to see how we can improve that. And the whole idea and the whole reason why the Coalition for Women in Journalism was launched was the magnitude of difference women journalists face all over the world, from east to the west. All the world have unequal parts for women journalists, whether it's in the newsroom or on the field, and we keep documenting these kind of violations every day, and the average is like 5 cases a day, which is a lot from globally. And the founder, Kiran Aziz, she used to work as a journalist in very critical places like Mexico, Syria, or war zones, and she witnessed major challenges that women journalists were facing. So instead of just seeing those challenges, she decided to turn her trauma to some global help for all women journalists. And being helped by other women journalists around the world, it was possible for CFWIJ to be created, and it is just unbelievable the cases we document, and especially in this part of the world where you can see an increase of violations against women journalists every day. That's it.
Thank you, Dia, for sharing your perspective. And thanks a lot, because it must have been really hard, especially in such an important moment of your life, to receive such feedback from your employer. But I'm glad that you could find a way out. Also with the support of another employer and from an international outlet. My next question to both of you is actually kind of related to what we have already started discussing. So as I also mentioned before, research that has been conducted internationally or at country level in different parts of the world really highlights the gender-specific risks that women journalists face as part of their jobs. This could include workplace harassment or online threats and physical attacks. And you have already been talking about some of these issues. So I wanted to ask you if, again, what's your perspective on this? And also if you could share any helpful strategies to confront these stories. Perhaps we can start with Arzu.
Sure. Hearing what Dia was sharing her story, it just reminded me, how privileged some journalists are. And again, I feel like I fit into that bubble because I'm a freelancer. I didn't have this kind of experience. So kudos to the outlet that invited you to work for them. And I'm really just happy to hear that you continue. That's really excellent. But again, I think in a bigger picture, just to show that this is an issue and we all have different experiences, which brings me to your next question of the types of threats and attacks and disparity that we face. My experience is mostly related to what I've experienced online. The online harassment component of it. And it's been quite a journey for me because I first kind of learned about what online harassment is back in 2014 when I had my first hand experience in going through something that I thought was really the end of my career at the time, because the extent of or the volume of comments that I was receiving on Twitter, on Facebook, under my articles that had already been published until then was just so vast and so traumatizing that I really at some point thought of completely leaving the field, closing down my social media accounts and just trying to disappear, because I thought that was how you cope with the extent of harassment that you face. So to that end, it's a frustrating experience, it's a traumatizing experience. It's traumatizing both emotionally, but also professionally. And it's also time consuming, right? Because at the point when you learn that you're not the only one and you're not the first women journalist who's facing such kind of threats online, you realize that you're part of a much bigger group of women who have experienced these horrendous experiences, and that there are actually organizations, actors who are helping or who are providing or who are interested even in elevating your stories and bringing you together to sort of develop ideas on how to cope, how to develop strategies to cope with the extent of harassment that women journalists face online, or the extent of different forms of harassment, because there are many different forms of harassment that women journalists face. So I think that was an important lesson for me personally when I first learned myself what online harassment was. Once I started hearing stories of others, once I joined like a bigger conversation around what online harassment is and what journalists are experiencing, and once I started engaging in that conversation, because I didn't want to stay silent. And this is like one of the other side effects, right? Side effects, it sounds really medical, but one of the purposes of online harassment or online threats that you face is to intimidate you into silence, right? So that you are completely cut off from your A, source of income, and B, what you love doing, right? Because we're in this job because this is what we enjoy, love, and appreciate doing. And it was quite a roller coaster of a ride for myself, because I went from feeling completely isolated, really feeling like it was the end, to now 6-7 years later, when I know what it is, when I can actually provide help myself to women journalists who do experience it, just jump on a call with them, text them saying, you know what, you're not alone. This is not an isolated case. Don't take it seriously. I know how to differentiate where it's coming from, how to document it, which has been like one of my coping mechanisms, which I think is also what you've asked, right? Like how we cope with it. I started documenting my harassers. I started taking screenshots, saving their URL addresses, looking them up, because I really wanted to know where and who are these people are and where these people are coming from. And it was remarkable because, you know, there were some real people, there were some bot accounts, and it put me in this unique position where I was like, you know what, I'm going to write about these people, but I don't want to write it just about myself. I want to tell a bigger picture. And so I used that research and documentation to tell a bigger story of political trolling that exists in Azerbaijan, which is coordinated, which is very targeted, specifically at certain representatives of civil society in the country like Azerbaijan. So to wrap it up, I know I went on for a while, jumping from one thing to another. You know, it's been in many ways now I feel that the fact that I had a chance to experience this was good, as weird as it may sound, because at least I know what to do now, and I know how to help others and be part of a bigger conversation in trying to resolve, or at least find mechanisms that would help resolve this eventually, whether through conversations, discussions, workshops, or just simply sharing stories and encouraging other women to share their stories as well.
Thank you, Arzu. Dia, would you have anything to share on this question?
I wanted to just add, I'm really happy that Arzu just decided to not stay silent about that. And it's very important that online threats are very often ignored. And it's really important for women journalists to be aware that online threats can go really far. And it's just one of the things we are trying to do in our coalition, to report and be as much as possible vocal about those, because we have been reporting really serious cases that started from online threats but ended up extremely bad. So I'm really happy that there are journalists like Arzu and others in Europe that decided to just be very vocal about that.
Yes, thank you, Dia. And Arzu, I also wanted to ask you, especially in relation to your experience, your story of experiencing online threats. And thanks for sharing this story with us today. In particular, I was curious to know what, if any, were the responses of law enforcement in your case. Also, from your experience, from your perspective, what do you think they could do differently or change if there were any gaps that you noticed, for example, in the response? And also, what, in your opinion, what is the role of social media platforms, both when reporting these abuses and also when the investigations are carried out? If you think they should have a role also in preventing or highlighting these cases.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think I need to start by saying that law enforcement response can only be effective in countries where there is rule of law, right? And we cannot, and we have seen that in some countries where women journalists have reported cases of severe threats that they faced online, that there have been little action specifically because of the context within country context within which they live. And so, sure, there are countries that we've seen like France or Finland where there are measures in place that could be implemented by law enforcement specifically at people who target journalists. But I think it really depends on the legal framework and the effectiveness of law enforcement in countries. In my personal case, I never resorted to that because honestly, trusting law enforcement in Azerbaijan would be a little too naive on my behalf. So I didn't follow through with that. And at the time of that harassment experience of that whole period, I was actually away. I was based in Istanbul already, then I was in Prague at some point. And because a lot of the threats were coming in from Azerbaijan, there was also the geographical location was also important because I wasn't there. However, from the experience in Turkey, because at the time it was all kind of happening, the threats were coming not just from Azerbaijan, but also from Turkey. There was a response. We received two visitors. I think at the newsroom at the time where I was writing as a writer, they received two officers who offered to offer their services to protect me, as in bodyguards that were sent by the government here in Turkey. And again, I declined that offer, A, because I was away, and B, even if I was in the country at the time, I would not want to walk with bodyguards because it just felt like, it was just a Band-Aid solution, right? The main threat was not being dealt with. The main problem was not being dealt with. So that's been my experience. As to the second part of your question about the role and responsibility of the social media platforms, I think the responsibility is great, and this is why there's been so much advocacy around pushing for social media platforms to provide better response mechanisms, better solution mechanisms to journalists who are facing a barrage of different forms of harassment on their platforms. And there have been some progress in some cases where the platforms come together, they pledge to provide better protection. But I think we're still lagging behind and seeing real solutions. And part of the reason for that is also because at social media companies, at these companies, there is a profound lack of country context within which these companies do not have much of a financial presence. I mean, they're not benefiting financially from those countries. So, for instance, in countries like Azerbaijan, where there's very little financial incentive for the companies, you don't really have people within these companies who understand, who study, and who can then give feedback and respond to reports that they get from journalists on the ground. And we've seen a number of examples in the last couple of years where this has been the case. Where we've reported a post or a page or a group that's been consistently targeting individuals or groups of people who have been either reporters or who have been against war or other social issues and political issues, with Facebook not addressing our reports, just saying that this was not in violation of their community guideline standards, community standards. And that's specifically and precisely because they don't understand the context and they don't understand the type of pressure and the type of threats these people are facing and going through when they're targeted in this way. So lack of political, contextual, and language understanding also is a problem, which really needs a solution if they really want to address it, if they really want to address the problem of online harassment on their platforms. And one other thing, and this is perhaps something that you may have also heard, there's been a conversation around asking platforms to share their algorithms that are the first respondents to reports that are being sent to these platforms in case of a harassment or of a certain threat. The fact that these algorithms are not disclosed, they're not disclosed to a wider civil society, international organizations audience in order to improve it, also kind of makes this process lag behind in offering better solutions and mechanisms for people who are affected by the harassment that takes place on these platforms.
Thank you very much, Arzu, for your insights, for your response. It's really, most of your recommendations, let's say, are also part of our advocacy in Article 19. So I'm very happy to hear that we are that you share some of our lines of advocacy. Dia, I would just turn to you for the last question of today's discussion. I was curious to know, as part of your work for the Coalition for Women in Journalism, if you could please share with us some avenues or initiatives in support of women journalists. If, for example, there are any good practices that you'd like to share as part of your work.
Before I get to your question, I would go back to the harassments that Arzu was talking, and I wanted to, if that's okay, I wanted to give a wider picture of what kind of threats women journalists were facing in Europe, if that's okay with the time.
Sure. Go ahead, thank you.
During the last year, we have seen an increase of violations against women journalists for 16.7%. And the top three trends have been detention, physical assault, and legal harassment, except for online harassment. And only in Europe, 42 women journalists were detained. That is only from between January and October 2021. And the countries with the most number of detentions were Belarus, Russia, Azerbaijan, and Poland. Out of 29 cases that we have been recording of physical attacks, 16 were only in Georgia. The map shows that the eastern part of the continent was the part where the most cases have been reported from. And at least 17 cases, women journalists were threatened with violence or intimidation. And one of the countries was Northern Ireland, where there were more violations recording. And being a woman, again, I'm going to go back and motherhood and woman journalists, what women journalists can be facing is the case of the award-winning crime reporter Patricia Devlin. I want to mention her because she was sent really horrific threat messages and posts targeting her son on Facebook. She was threatened with sexual violence against her minor son, which is one of the most severe cases we have been documented during 2021. And going back to your question, we totally believe that law enforcement should be involved in protecting women journalists. in some countries like Pakistan and Canada and Turkey, we have already tried some tactics to get responsible authorities take notice. In Pakistan, we have helped draft a journalist protection bill. In Egypt, we have worked with opposition party members and parliamentarians to raise awareness of issues women journalists face. We did the same in Mexico, and we are working in daily basis with European institutions like European Parliament, European Commission. So this is one of the ways that by us or other press freedom organization being involved in law enforcement, there should be specific laws with very specific articles protecting women journalists, because we live in a time when many cases are ignored by just because some officials don't really think from the perspective how difficult it is for women journalists to be working on the ground. And this is one of the ways. So we are going to be very present in any law amendments in each European country, and we are hoping that our recommendations will be considered. And of course, we are not backing up. We are working with many other organizations who are willing to contribute in that, and all the European institutions are in our loop for any legal acts that are being taken in that regard.
Thank you very much, Dia, for your insights, and actually thank you both for sharing your perspectives, your stories, your recommendations with us today. It was an extremely interesting discussion on such an important topic, and I really thank you, and we are very grateful for the time you dedicated to us today.
Thank you so much, Roberta, Dee, and Arzu. And thank you for watching us. You may find more information on MFRR support covering practical and legal support, training sessions, residency programs on mfrr.eu. And do not forget to follow us on Twitter and YouTube, and also follow us next week during the MFRR Summit 2022, Boosting Press Freedom. Thank you for watching us.